6th of June, 1944, D-Day. 156,000 British, American and Canadian soldiers are transported across the English Channel in the largest seaborne invasion ever attempted.
It's an almost unimaginable scale now to put a huge army across the Channel against a defended shore.
After years of pressure from Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill has finally agreed to open a second front in Europe and send Allied troops to liberate occupied France. From there, they will fight their way across to Germany, and with the Red Army advancing from the east, finally bring down Hitler's fascist empire. The success of D-Day will allow a total of 2 million Allied troops and 9 million tons of armaments and supplies to be landed on the beaches at Normandy.
It finally brought Allied ground forces within reach of Germany itself.
And yet, just 3 months later, the Big Three's optimism will turn to despair as the Allies attempt to bulldoze their way as quickly as possible across Europe comes to a grinding halt.
Operation Market Garden, an attempt to end the war by Christmas, turned into one of the great military disasters of World War II, where the so-called bridge too far.
Operation Market Garden will lead to 17,000 Allied casualties, as well as thousands more dead and wounded Dutch civilians.
Als je terugkijkt wat er gebeurd is, dan hebben we vreselijk ons best gedaan. En zijn we er ook trots op dat we dat gedaan hebben.
During 1943, debate over the timing of a Western invasion of mainland Europe had come close to breaking the Grand Alliance. With his forces sustaining colossal losses in the east, Stalin was impatient for a second front to be opened in Western Europe without delay. Churchill, however, preferred an attack through the Mediterranean via Sicily and Italy, Europe's soft underbelly. Roosevelt was caught in the middle, but ultimately backed Stalin in return for the Soviet leader's declaration of war against Japan.
Churchill has this imperial holdover of really seeing the Eastern Mediterranean as key to Europe. You could make the argument that he experienced the failure of an amphibious landing in the First World War, and he didn't want to relive it again in France in the Second World War. So he has a sort of natural aversion in addition to believing actually that you could form a pincer movement and divide the Germans on two fronts, which is what he's trying to do by going up through the Balkans and up through Italy.
Stalin argued for the opening of the Second Front in northern France, not only because he thought this would support the Soviet war effort, it was vital to victory over Hitler, but he wanted equality and prestige of his own within the Big Three. He wanted to be treated as a partner within this trio, and he thought he was, not receiving the credit that he was due. And so it comes down to personal relationships again in this sense.
In February 1943, Churchill had begun to yield to Stalin's pressure and had promised a cross-channel operation in August or September of that year. When this was postponed for more than 8 months, Stalin was incandescent and recalled his ambassadors from London and Washington in protest. Operation Overlord had an inauspicious beginning.
Stalin was insistent on Operation Overlord because he knew how much pain his people were coming under on the Eastern Front, how many people were dying in their millions, and that they couldn't sustain this forever.
Then in January 1944, Churchill assured Stalin that he was now going full blast for Overlord and the opening of a second front. But the invasion's commander would not be British. In a distinct shift in the balance of power of the Big Three, D-Day would be led by an American, General Dwight D. Eisenhower. Stalin and Roosevelt both supported the idea of a new world order and considered Churchill and his British imperialism as a relic of a bygone age.
Despite people like Churchill hoping indeed that the empire would carry on and Britain could carry on as before, the realities and the ideologies were different, and which meant it could not be carried on.
In early 1944, Churchill was on a charm offensive, hailing the tremendous victories of the Russian armies, and described the new confidence which has grown in our hearts towards Stalin. But with the Red Army now close to the Polish border, tensions within the Big Three were growing. Britain had guaranteed Polish independence in 1939, and the country's government in exile was based in London. Churchill made intense efforts to broker a Polish-Soviet agreement. But would his new confidence in Stalin prove to be misplaced? By now, Soviet advances against the Nazis were unstoppable. On the 27th of January 1944, the Red Army finally liberated Leningrad, ending a siege that had lasted almost 2.5 years. Stalin believed that even if Roosevelt and Churchill broke their promise to invade France, the Soviets would have enough power to finish off Hitler's Germany alone. Stalin was thriving, but his allies were not. The Nazis had renewed their bombing of London. And in February, Churchill cabled Roosevelt to say, "We have just had a stick of bombs around 10 Downing Street, and there are no more windows." Britain was war-weary, and so was Churchill. He looked old, tired, and very depressed. Roosevelt was equally exhausted, and now also gravely ill, with heart disease, cardiac failure, and acute bronchitis. And his standing in the polls was sinking.
If Overlord had been a catastrophe, then it would have been very bad for both of them as leaders, I think. Roosevelt, he wants to carry on being president. He wants to run for a final term, and he needs to show momentum. He needs to show success, and those sorts of things matter in a democracy. So for both of them, I think the repercussions could have been very serious if it had been a complete disaster. Of course, it was very tough, and it was not a foregone conclusion.
As Roosevelt's popularity continued to weaken, Joseph Kennedy told Churchill's emissary, Beaverbrook, that he was certain Roosevelt faced defeat. Overlord had to be a triumph, or the alliance would crumble. To ensure Operation Overlord's success, the Allies instigated an intricate campaign of fake operations and disinformation called Bodyguard, approved on Christmas Day, 1943. The aim was to mislead the Nazis about the location and timing of key Allied military offensives. The most significant was Operation Fortitude. Fortitude North aimed to convince the Germans that the Allied invasion in 1944 would come through Norway and Sweden. Fortitude South sought to persuade them that the Pas-de-Calais would be the main invasion site in France, and that any action directed at Normandy was merely a diversion. The campaign successfully persuaded the Nazis to deploy forces and reserves to irrelevant locations and limited Hitler's options. This was not just a matter of fake intelligence being leaked. The Allies placed an entire fictitious fighting force, the 1st US Army Group, in Kent, directly opposite the French port of Calais. Roads, bridges, airfields and embarkation points were built, and fake planes and landing craft were put in place. False radio messages were transmitted to give an added sense of fevered activity. This ingenious plan would culminate on the evening before D-Day, when the Allies launched a mock invasion from Dover, diverting Nazi forces away from the real invasion in Normandy.
I don't think we should underestimate exactly what was at risk here. it wasn't just about the boots on the ground, so to speak, but we needed deception plans. We needed to use every single tool. Of course, Churchill loved all that unorthodox stuff. He was interested in the commandos and then supported SOE, being drop agents behind enemy lines. He loved secret gadgets, exploding rats, whatever it was, he was for it.
To command this ghost army, the Allies selected one of their most cunning and able generals, George S. Patton. Allied intelligence had already identified Patton as the general most respected by the Nazis, so his appointment was leaked to the Germans to bolster the deception.
They set Patton up in Kent with a whole supposed army group. They had him driving around inspecting troops, pretending to be the first US Army group, which was going to bounce across the Channel and attack Calais and Boulogne. They had inflatable tanks and all this sort of stuff parked in fields so that any German aeroplanes could spot them and report back at this sort of immense concentration. So they spent a lot of time convincing the Germans that the main attack was going to be at the narrowest point of the Channel across the Pas-de-Calais.
For Patton himself, a man of action, being the leader of a fake army was tortuous. But Operation Fortitude would have a lasting effect on German operations.
And that was so successful that even after D-Day, the Germans still thought that the main attack hadn't come yet and kept forces in the Pas-de-Calais. They also had another completely fictitious army group in Scotland, which was supposed to go over and invade Norway to distract the Germans and force them to keep forces in Norway. They had all sorts of fun running around with all kinds of schemes, greatly helped by the fact that they could read enough Enigma traffic by this stage to know which of these deceptions were working and which ones weren't.
Although the intelligence operation was successful, the full-scale D-Day rehearsals in April 1944 were anything but. Operation Tiger on Slapton Sands in Devon turned into a catastrophe as Allied forces came under heavy attack from German E-boats and were embroiled in friendly fire incidents. In all, nearly 1,000 men were killed or wounded. Nothing, however, would be allowed to stop this invasion. And on the 6th of June 1944, an armada set off from the south coast of England. The flotilla was supported by more than 18,000 men from the US 82nd and 101st Airborne, as well as the British 6th Airborne Division. They were dropped into enemy territory in the early hours of the morning to seize bridges and secure the beachheads ahead of the landings. 3,000 landing craft, as well as 2,500 ships and 500 naval vessels were transporting more than 156,000 American, British and Canadian soldiers across the English Channel. They would disembark on 5 beaches along the 50-mile Normandy coastline. The British and American divisions had been training since 1942, but nothing could prepare them for the reality of what lay ahead.
We'll never know, without doubt. Preparation on the scale, it's an almost unimaginable scale now. To put a huge army across the Channel against a defended shore, every day that went by gave you another day's preparation. So I think every day earlier would have made just that little less chance of success.
When the Seaborne units began to land at 6:30 a.m., the British and Canadians on Gold, Juno and Sword beaches overcame light opposition from the Germans, as did the Americans at Utah. However, at Omaha Beach, the US 1st Division was met by the best of the German coastal defenses, the 352nd, and continuously fired on by machine gunners as they came on shore. Omaha threatened to fail, and only dedicated leadership got the troops inland, but not without cost. More than 2,000 American casualties were sustained on this one beach. Hitler, notoriously nocturnal, did not wake up until midday on June the 6th, long after the landings had begun. As soon as he heard the news, he sent the 21st Panzer Division into the gap between the British and Canadian beaches. Had the Germans reached the sea, the landings might not have succeeded. But fierce resistance by British anti-tank gunners turned the tide. It was also a victory for British intelligence, and their subsequent surveillance of captured German commanders.
We rarely think about all those top commanders that were captured on the battlefields of Normandy, in France, and all the way down to the invasion of Germany. What happened to them? Well, they were brought back. Generals, a couple of field marshals, over 50 German generals ended up in British captivity, and we needed the intelligence from them. And British intelligence bugged their conversations and got intelligence which now is being recognised as having turned the course of the war.
The D-Day victory was reported extensively in the newspapers and in cinemas in both the UK and the US. But the victory was bittersweet.
Some of the guys that had come back from, and they're in the States, they're in the hospital wanting to know, they want to see what's going on, but they can't because, you know, they don't have TVs. And so a lot of people were wondering what was happening to their loved one. And that was something that was a little bit harder, unless it was in the newspaper. Probably about 5 days later or 6 days later, they'd get the newspaper to find out if one of their loved ones was killed or not.
Allied troops who had not yet been shipped over to join their colleagues also watched the landings on the news.
Toen las ik in de bioscoop dat D-Day was begonnen. En daar werd bij verteld dat de eerste kerels die geland waren, die zouden uit het strand in Normandië oprukken, Normandië in. En het gebied waarin geland werd, dat was vreselijk groot. Weet je hoe lang dat gebied langs het strand was? Wist je dat? 84 kilometer. En toen zei ze van in die 84 kilometer werd op 5 plaatsen geland. En op 5 plaatsen gingen ze het land in. En dan kwamen ze ongetwijfeld, kwamen de kerels die hier vandaan kwamen, waren weer hier. En de kerels die hier zaten, die gingen die kant op. En die ontmoetten elkaar. En die zouden dan elkaar vragen wat of ze kwamen doen. En dat zouden ze in het Engels doen. Dat Engels sprekende kerels werden geland op die day.
In 5 days, the beaches were fully secured in the hands of the Americans and British. And more than 326,000 men, 100,000 tons of equipment, and 50,000 vehicles had arrived. Mulberry Bee, a temporary harbour, was built. And over the next 10 months, it was used to bring in 2.5 million troops, 500,000 vehicles, and 4 million tons of supplies. Rudy Hemmers had made his way from the Netherlands to England to train as a soldier. Now he was on his way back to fight.
En daar was het vreselijk druk met allemaal bootjes die ergens naar het landingsbedrijf terrein toe gingen. En waar wij waren in Arromanches, waar die haven werd gebouwd. En de schepen waar wij in zaten, die werden geland aan de kade van de haven. En iedereen die dacht dat wij tot hier in het water gingen om te landen, die zaten er helemaal naast. Want we stapten het bootje uit en stonden op de kade.
British and Canadian divisions bore the brunt of German resistance, enabling American forces to break out and make the initial running into France. The small fields, thick hedges, and narrow sunken lanes favored the defending Germans, and infantry casualties were heavy. But Hitler's intolerance of tactical withdrawals meant that his forces were eventually trapped, and 60,000 German soldiers were killed or captured. Nearly all their guns, tanks, and vehicles were abandoned. Stalin had got what he wanted. A second front had been opened, and the Allied troops began to advance through France.
The invasion of northern France was a huge landing, a huge operation, and it did make a huge contribution to the defeat of Hitler. The Soviet Union would not have been able to maintain their momentum without a assault from the other side, from Western Europe. It also created the nightmare scenario for the Germans, because for them, they remembered back to the First World War, where they'd faced a war on two fronts, and this was a central reason why they were defeated in 1918.
It finally brought Allied ground forces within reach of Germany itself. Remember, up till now, Germany controlled vast swathes of Europe, east and west, and south, given Italy being a member of the Axis. So it was never their fight on their land. And this now, for the first time, and from the east and from the west, Germany itself becomes threatened by Allied attack.
On the 25th of August 1944, Paris was liberated. With the Germans now in full retreat, the Allies advanced rapidly on a broad front through northeastern France and Belgium, towards the borders of the Third Reich. It would be here, however, that the German Wehrmacht would make its final stand against the Western Allies. After the success of D-Day, the Allies believed victory was in sight and could be achieved by Christmas 1944. Advancing a staggering 342 miles in 6 days, British tanks swept through northern France and into Belgium with little resistance. The British Second Army, led by the Welsh Guards, advanced to the south, entering Brussels to an ecstatic welcome on the 3rd of September. The next day, Antwerp fell to the 11th Armoured Division. US General Marshall told his commanders that cessations of hostilities in the war against Germany may occur at any time. The Allies planned to drop paratroopers into Berlin in the event of a sudden German collapse, to try to secure the city before the Red Army got there. They did not consider that the largely abandoned Siegfried Line would still prove a major obstacle, or that fuel for their tanks would soon be in short supply. By mid-September 1944, Allied confidence was beginning to look severely misplaced.
When the Germans finally crumbled at the end of the Battle of Normandy, the Falaise pocket closed and all of that, their withdrawal was then precipitate. Paris fell within days, Brussels early September. There was a real sense that Allies had broken the Wehrmacht, but I think they underestimated the extraordinary ability which they had demonstrated so clearly on the Russian front to regroup, to reorganize, and very rapidly turn it round.
Operation Market Garden, devised by Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery, was to be the largest airborne operation in the history of warfare. Its aim was to secure the key bridges over 3 Dutch rivers in order to outflank the heavy Nazi defenses of the Siegfried Line and enter the German heartland. It involved around 35,000 British, American, and Polish airborne and glider troops, who would meet up with the British Armoured Division on the ground.
The aim of Operation Market Garden was to take strategically important bridges and routes around Eindhoven and Nijmegen, and ultimately, of course, we had to cross the Rhine, so it's preparations ready for the invasion of Germany.
A strategic thrust. That was the great idea. The strategic aim was to cross a number of water obstacles with rivers, canals, in order to give a breakout position into not only Germany, but into the Ruhr, into Germany's industrial heartland, and thence to Berlin.
On the 17th of September 1944, Allied paratroopers were dropped over the Netherlands. These included the British 1st Airborne, the Red Devils, who were dropped into Arnhem and the surrounding area. A handful of them managed to secure the northern end of the Arnhem Bridge. But German counterattacks cut them off from the landing zones and forced more than 2,000 men into a pocket near the village of Oosterbeek, several miles away. The British airmen had few anti-tank weapons, limited food and supplies, and their ammunition was running low. By the night of the 25th of September, the main body of troops had been forced to withdraw from the Oosterbeek perimeter. From this point, all British and American troops began to withdraw, leaving behind more than 15,000 Allied casualties, as well as thousands of dead Dutch civilians.
It was the scheme promoted by the British General Bernard Montgomery, who felt that he should have been in command of Allied forces rather than Eisenhower. The Americans accepted a plan drawn up largely by the British, which turned into one of the great military disasters of World War II, the so-called Bridge Too Far.
Monty's bold bid for glory proved a humiliation. The whole operation had been hampered by dense fog, thick clouds, and radio communication failure. The British ground landing zones were too far from Arnhem. A lack of aircraft meant the drop took 3 days, vastly reducing any element of surprise. And Allied commanders ignored British intelligence that 2 SS Panzer divisions were in the area.
Because, of course, German troops were being mapped all the time in map rooms across Britain, and we didn't know where 9 and 10 Panzer Division were. They were hiding somewhere. And their location was picked up just 3 days before Operation Market Garden. But the intelligence was not acted upon, and it does raise questions as to why, whether Market Garden could, even that late, have been stopped.
Although Montgomery called the operation 90% successful, in reality, it was a valiant failure. The Allies had failed to establish a bridgehead over the Rhine, and they would now have to fight their way into the Reich on a broad front.
Yes, the Allies did underestimate German strength. If they had been able to launch it 2 weeks previously, then the Germans might have been weak enough for it to work. But by the time that it was eventually launched, the Germans had a couple of weeks to catch their breath, start to reorganize themselves, build and rebuild the defenses a bit. But even if it had all worked 2 weeks previously, they would still have been holding a very exposed salient, because although they might have captured the bridge at Arnhem, there was always going to be another river.
After the debacle of Operation Market Garden, morale was low, and tensions again became evident between the Allies. The majority of the forces in Northern Europe were American, and they wanted the main say in how the war was run. They considered Montgomery to be a whining, arrogant, opinionated and self-serving Brit, desperate for the credit for the final victories.
Montgomery, some would accuse him of seeking personal glory here. He would deny that absolutely vehemently and say, no, strategically, this is the best way to finish the war. It's the quickest way.
Despite this, relations between Roosevelt and Churchill seemed to be at their best. Just before Operation Market Garden, Churchill had heaped praise on Roosevelt at the Quebec Conference, and subsequent meetings saw them discuss ways to deindustrialize and divide Germany after the war through the Morgenthau Plan. The mood was equally cordial at the Moscow Conference at the Kremlin in October 1944, attended by Churchill, the foreign ministers of all 3 countries, and hosted, of course, by Stalin. British military leaders were growing increasingly anxious about the Soviets as the Red Army began to encroach further into Eastern and Southern Europe during the autumn of 1944. In response, Churchill devised a plan to maintain British influence in Greece and the Mediterranean, protecting its imperial interests.
So his bottom line is to persuade the Soviets, to persuade the Greek communists to cooperate and not to attempt to oppose the King of Greece, who Churchill was very keen on putting back on his throne. What happens is this broadens out into a proposed arrangement of percentage of influence over the countries of southeastern Europe, so Greece, Romania, Yugoslavia, Bulgaria and Hungary. And Churchill suggests that they divided in terms of percentages.
The Americans opposed the idea. Whatever the British said, they feared it could turn into a post-war dispute over Allied-occupied Europe between Britain and the Soviet Union. During a state dinner, Churchill slipped Stalin a list dividing up the Balkans into spheres of influence by percentages. Stalin is said to have looked at the list and ticked it, indicating his approval. They also discussed the idea that the Soviet Union needed a ring of independent pro-Soviet buffer states, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary, to protect its border.
Now, for Stalin, this is not a controversial thing because he did not really care about the status of countries. He was interested in expanding Soviet power. Where the percentage agreement is controversial is for Churchill and Roosevelt and why they agreed to this. You know, the democratic powers agreeing to carve up Europe in this backroom deal, you know, in a way that kind of fitted Stalin's methods much more than it fitted theirs.
The fates of many millions were decided over dinner, while the Allied forces were struggling to bring a swift end to the war. By September 1944, US forces were approaching the Hurtgen forest on the Siegfried Line, the fortified wall of concrete and steel extending along Germany's western borders from the Netherlands to Switzerland. This densely wooded area was said by US intelligence to be relatively undefended, giving troops a clear route across the Siegfried Line, the Rhine, and on to Berlin. They were wrong. Hurtgen was one of the most heavily fortified areas of the Siegfried Line. 200 square miles of dense woods and ravines, packed with minefields, and gunners in concealed pillboxes. From behind these formidable defenses, a very few Germans could pin down a great many Allied soldiers. Fierce fighting raged here from September 1944 to February 1945.
It was a long, drawn-out slogging match for a wooded area which didn't have that much, in my view, tactical significance. They got bogged down, and perhaps it was a question of who blinked first, and neither was prepared to.
Soldiers called the forest the Death Factory, as it claimed 33,000 American casualties. It was one of the greatest defeats the US Army has ever suffered. For 3 months, the Nazis held at bay the vastly better supplied and better equipped US troops, while just a few miles south, 3 German field armies assembled in secrecy for the Ardennes offensive, the so-called Battle of the Bulge, designed to push the Allies out of Northern Europe once and for all. On the 16th of December 1944, more than 200,000 German troops and nearly 1,000 tanks launched Operation Watch on the Rhine, Hitler's last major offensive on the Western Front. Seeking to drive to the coast and split the Allied armies, the Germans struck in the Ardennes Forest, a 75-mile stretch held by 4 US divisions. The Nazis broke through, surrounding US Army infantry divisions, seizing key crossroads and advancing nearly 50 miles towards the strategically vital Meuse River. This created the bulge in the Western Front that gave the battle its name.
The Battle of the Bulge was, of course, Hitler's last throw of the dice, where he commits a massive force of panzers and his crack troops to try to break through the Allied line. Eisenhower, much to Montgomery's disgust, had pursued a strategy of broad advancement. And broad advancement meant that the line of advancement was thinly defended. Coming through the Ardennes, the German forces were virtually achieved a breakthrough, but the Americans held them off. It was largely the Americans doing at very heavy cost. The Americans lost more in the Battle of the Bulge than in any other battle in Europe in the war, and it was a triumph of American arm.
It shattered Allied complacency. Churchill asked Stalin to mount a new offensive. Eisenhower sent an emissary to Moscow to share strategy and request support. But ultimately, American forces would be left to fight what Churchill described afterwards as the greatest American battle of the war. In 6 bloody weeks, 19,000 Allied soldiers were confirmed dead. Overall, 81,000 US servicemen were killed, injured, or assumed missing in action. German casualties were even higher, with around 100,000 men killed or injured, a third of the attacking force. In addition, more than 800 tanks and 1,000 planes were destroyed.
The Battle of the Bulge was a shock. I don't know whether it was the biggest shock. It was, you know, it was a significant setback when things had seemed to be going so well.
The Battle of the Bulge delayed the Allies' final offensive and left the Americans' supplies of fuel and ammunition almost exhausted. Nevertheless, it broke the German backbone.
No, it didn't destroy it. It wore it down terribly because they put several armored divisions into the Bulge, which they lost. And you know, you can't keep losing equipment because by this time, of course, German industry was under severe bombing from both the Royal Air Force and the United States Army Air Force.
The Siegfried Line was fatally compromised, and the way was now clear for the Allies to advance on Germany. Meanwhile, the diversion of German troops from the Eastern Front to fight in the Battle of the Bulge left the way clear for the Red Army to move into Poland. And on the 12th of January 1945, Stalin's troops launched the Vistula offensive. The Red Army took just over 2 weeks to sweep across Poland, take almost all of East Prussia, and drive deep into Silesia. By the 2nd of February, they were less than 50 miles from Berlin.
The launch of the Vistula-Oder offensive was scheduled for the 20th of January. However, Stalin brought it forward to the 12th. Now, sometimes this is explained because he listened to Churchill's appeals. Churchill wanted this offensive starting because the Germans had launched the Battle of the Bulge in the Ardennes, and this would put more pressure on the German army. However, the real reason for this, well, the more important reason, as far as Stalin was concerned, was that there was going to be a thaw in the weather in late January, and the tanks simply would not be able to traverse the ground if it wasn't frozen. And so it really comes down to the weather. That's why this operation was launched when it was. It wasn't necessarily about Stalin listening to Churchill's appeals, however much he claimed that was the case at the later Yalta Conference.
On the 27th of January 1945, as the Soviets continued their march into Poland, the Russian soldiers encountered shocking scenes as they entered Auschwitz and liberated around 7,000 remaining prisoners. Most were Jews. All were extremely sick and weak. Many were near death. These men, women and children had been left behind after the SS forced the rest of the inmates on death marches. At least 1.3 million people were deported to Auschwitz between 1940 and 1945, and of these, at least 1.1 million were murdered. Reports of the death camps and gas chambers, some from escapees, had reached the Big Three earlier in the war.
All of the Big Three knew about Auschwitz, and they knew about German concentration camps. Stalin certainly knew about the camp and what the Germans were doing to the Jews of Europe and the Holocaust. However, Stalin does not disseminate that information. He doesn't tell his military. And so they came across camps like Auschwitz, and they hadn't known what they were. We have to ask, why did Stalin do this? Why did he not inform his generals about, they should be liberating these camps? And sometimes Stalin's anti-Semitism is pointed to as an explanation, but it seems to be that during the war years, he was just indifferent to the fate of the Jews. For him, this was not a strategic priority. The liberation of Auschwitz was not going to help him conquer Poland. And so it came down to what his priorities were, and the Jews did not fit into that picture.
Stalin had overseen the murder of 2 million people at least, and the starvation of probably 6 million others in the 1930s. Didn't mean anything to him. To Churchill, however, I think Churchill felt great personal sorrow, but asked himself the question of, what can we do?
In July 1945, Churchill wrote, "This is probably the greatest and most horrible crime ever committed in the whole history of the world. and it has been done by scientific machinery, by nominally civilized men, in the name of a great state. Roosevelt and Churchill did consider appeals to bomb the camps, but they were told that no military gain would be achieved. Instead, all resources were devoted to achieving ultimate victory over the Nazis.
The Americans had advanced knowledge of what was going on. The question was what could be done about it. There were several strategies. Could you have bombed the railway lines into the death camps? Could you have bombed the death camps? Could you have issued some warning that anybody involved in the extermination of Jews would be hanged as a war criminal after the war? None of these things were done. Why wasn't military action taken? Because the military planners said, look, we're not committing military resources on a speculative venture when we have to use them to shorten the war in realistic military engagements that we know we can win, rather than engagements whose outcome is uncertain.
During the wartime itself, we now know from declassified files, these are intelligence files, that information about the Holocaust, about concentration camps, about serious mass murders were taking place, of course, of Jews, of Poles and Russians. And this was happening in 1941. Bletchley Park was picking up messages from the roving police units. The bugged conversations at some secret sites in Britain, Trent Park being one of them, near Cockfosters. At these sites, we were regularly picking up very, very detailed accounts.
Auschwitz would not be the last concentration camp discovered by the Allies as they progressed into Germany. By the end of January 1945, victory was in sight, but it would come tragically late for many millions. Next time on Race to Victory, the Allies march across the borders into Nazi Germany. But who will go on to claim the biggest prize of all, Berlin?
This is the capital, the heartland of the darkness that was Nazi Germany. This said, they have been defeated. We are in Berlin.
As the Allies prepare for their final battles, a new competition develops, one that threatens to split the Big Three apart. A race to build nuclear weapons.
There is a theory that one of the reasons the Americans dropped the bomb on Japan was precisely to show the Soviets that they had this thing.
With victory so close, can the Big Three maintain their relationship and bring peace to the war-torn world? Or will this new race take over and ultimately tear the alliance apart?